The universe, in all its infinite permutations, operates according to laws. This is what Starfleet teaches. This is what every officer aboard the USS Enterprise understood when they accepted their commission. That the cosmos, however strange, however vast, however alien, bends to principles that can be measured, recorded, and ultimately understood. Physics does not lie. Sensors do not dream. And yet, in the dying seconds of what had been a routine calibration run through the Viridian corridor, every console on the Enterprise bridge screamed something that no physics textbook in the Federation had ever prepared them for. The rift opened without warning. It did not behave like a wormhole. It did not resemble a Badron aperture or the cold mathematics of a transwarp conduit. It tore. That was the only word Lieutenant Commander Data would later use in his official report. And even he acknowledged the term carried an unsettling emotional weight. The fabric of space simply tore, edges burning white and gold, radiating energy signatures that cycled through 6 distinct classifications before settling on none of them, and before a single evasive maneuver could be plotted, before Helm Officer Lieutenant Parham could bring the ship about. The Enterprise was through. Then silence, not the silence of deep space, which carries its own familiar emptiness that every Starfleet officer learns to find comforting. This was a different silence, heavier, older, somehow pressurized, as though the void here had been holding its breath for a very long time. Captain Jean-Luc Picard gripped the armrests of his command chair and surveyed the view screen with the measured calm of a man who had stared down Borg cubes, temporal paradoxes, and the assembled judgment of the Q continuum. What he saw stopped even him. A planet hung below them, rust-red and ringed with dust, its surface half obscured by a debris field that was not geological in origin. Starships, dozens of them, locked in active combat. Energy weapons unlike any recorded in Federation. Archives lanced between vessels of radically different design, wedge-shaped craft against rounder, more organic configurations, and far below, on the planet's surface, sensor returns were painting a picture of ground combat on a scale that bordered on catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of life signs, energy discharges, explosions, a battle in its final, violent hours. Report, Picard said. Lieutenant Commander Worf, at Tactical, responded with the controlled urgency of a Klingon who recognized organized warfare when he saw it. We are in a star system with no Federation designation. No match in any navigational database. The stellar cartography is entirely unknown. The rift that brought us here has collapsed. I'm reading residual quantum variance, consistent with a dimensional boundary crossing. Captain, we are not in our galaxy. The bridge absorbed this in approximately 2 seconds before professionalism reasserted itself across every station. Confirmed, said Data from Ops. The stellar positioning places us in a region of space that does not correspond to any known galactic structure. The laws of physics appear broadly consistent with our own universe. Warp field mechanics would likely function. However, I am detecting energy signatures from both the vessels and the planetary surface that do not correspond to any cataloged technology. Additionally, Data paused, which was itself unusual enough to draw Picard's attention. I am detecting a bioenergetic field permeating this entire region of space. It is faint, distributed, and appears to be interactive with certain life forms below. It has no analog in Federation science. Can you quantify it? Not at this time, Captain. I lack the framework. If Data lacked the framework, they were truly somewhere new. Picard stood, clasping his hands behind his back, studying the battle with the eyes of a historian who knew that civilizations at war did not pause to greet strangers politely. Shields. Full stop. Cloak our warp signature if possible. I don't want either side in this conflict deciding. We're a third faction. He turned. Counselor. Deanna Troi had both hands pressed flat against her console, and her expression was one Picard had never seen on her before, not distress. Exactly, but something closer to vertigo. The emotional output from the surface is, she exhaled slowly, enormous. Fear, pain, grief, rage, but also something else. Something I can't categorize. There are presences down there that feel almost like concentrated. Emotion given physical form. It's not like reading humanoid minds. It's like standing next to a star. Empathic interference? No. Amplification. Whatever that bioenergetic field is, it's making everything I sense louder. Picard filed that away. Hail any vessel in range. Use universal translator protocols. Broadcast on all frequencies. All modulations. Identify us as a vessel of peaceful intent and request communication. The hails went unanswered, which surprised no one. Both fleets were too busy fighting to notice one more ship appearing in their orbit. Or if they noticed, they had chosen more pressing concerns. It was Beverly Crusher who changed everything, as she so often did. Not through command decisions or tactical calculations, but through the simple, irreducible act of doing her job. She had come to the bridge the moment red alert sounded, standing now at the secondary medical station near the turbolift, running her own scans alongside Data's broader sensor sweeps. Her tricorder was calibrated for biology, not astrophysics. And while the rest of the bridge mapped stars and ships, she was mapping life signs, sorting the living from the dying, cataloging injuries the way a doctor catalogs storm damage after the wind has passed. She found him at 1,407 hours, ship's time. One biosign, separated from the main concentration of life forms on the surface, located inside what sensors identified as a large enclosed structure, a hangar, possibly cut into the rock of the planet's surface. The life sign was human baseline, or close enough that the biofilters flagged it as priority, male, young, late adolescence by cellular markers, and he was bleeding out. Not metaphorically. The biosign showed catastrophic vascular trauma to the right upper extremity. Amputation, clean-edged, cauterized but incomplete in its physiological closure. Shock was setting in, blood pressure dropping. The body doing what bodies do when they have lost something they cannot grow back. Beverly was already moving toward Picard before she had finished reading the display. Captain, I have a critical medical emergency on the surface. Single life sign, severe traumatic amputation, hemorrhagic shock. Without intervention, he has perhaps 20 minutes. Picard turned. She knew that look, the look of a man calculating the prime directive against a human life. The equation that Starfleet taught in classrooms and that reality made infinitely more complicated. Doctor, we don't know whose war this is or what our presence here means. He's dying, Jean-Luc. Another beat of silence. Can you get a transporter lock? I can try. He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Anyone who knew Picard understood that 3 seconds was a very long time for him to deliberate on a question of conscience. Get him aboard, he said. And Beverly, do what you do. She was already walking toward the turbolift. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, or more Enterprise crews land in galaxies far, far away, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. The transporter room smelled like ozone and urgency. Chief O'Brien's successor at the transporter console, a young Balian ensign named Tef, had his fingers moving across the controls with the focused precision of someone who understood that speed and accuracy were not opposites, that in the right hands they were the same thing. Beverly stood on the operator's side of the console, tricorder open, watching the biofilter readings with the particular intensity she reserved for cases where the margin between intervention and autopsy was measured in minutes rather than hours. I have a partial lock, Tef reported. His blue forehead creased with concentration. The interference is significant, Commander. There's an energy field woven into the biosign itself. It's not technological. It's biological, but it's behaving like a carrier wave. Every time I isolate the pattern, it shifts slightly, like it's aware of the scan. Beverly filed that away for later. Can you compensate? Working on it. His fingers adjusted. The pattern buffer display flickered, stabilized, flickered again. The cauterization on the wound site is actually helping. The clean energy edge is giving me a reference point for the arm, or what's left of it. A pause. Ready, Commander. I can't guarantee the lock holds through materialization. The field keeps modulating. Do it. The familiar harmonic of the transporter, that sound. Beverly had heard 10,000 times. That particular shimmer of matter, becoming energy, becoming matter again, filled the room. But it was different this time. Longer. The confinement beam stuttered once, twice, and then with a sound like a chord played slightly out of tune. Anakin Skywalker materialized on the transporter pad. He was on his knees before he was fully solid. The boy, and he was a boy. That was Beverly's first clinical observation. 19 or 20 years old at most, hit the pad hard, his left hand slapping against the surface to catch himself, his right arm tucked against, his chest in the involuntary, protective posture of someone whose body had already cataloged the damage and was trying to minimize further trauma. He was dressed in layers of dark fabric, dusty and torn, and there was a braid of hair behind his right ear that swung forward as he pitched. His face was pale beneath a desert tan, sheened with the cold sweat of blood loss, and his eyes, when they snapped open, were the most startlingly blue eyes Beverly Crusher had ever seen on a human face. They were also, immediately, furious. Where, he tried to stand. His legs didn't cooperate. He tried again, jaw set with a stubbornness that Beverly recognized as the kind that killed patience. Where am I? What did you do to me? You're safe, Beverly said, moving toward him with her tricorder already scanning. You're aboard a starship. My name is Beverly Crusher. I'm a doctor, and you are in hemorrhagic shock. I need you to stop moving. I need to get back. He looked at his right arm. The look on his face when he registered the stump. The way his expression moved through recognition, rage, grief, and then a terrible forced composure in approximately 2 seconds, told Beverly more about this young man's psychology than any sensor reading could. He had already known. He was simply being reminded, and he hated being reminded. Obi-Wan, there was a fight. I have to. Your friend is alive, Beverly said. Because her scans showed multiple life signs in that hangar, several of them moving, one of them broadcasting, the same unusual bioenergetic field at a slightly different frequency. She didn't know which one was Obi-Wan. She was extrapolating to buy herself 30 seconds of compliance. It worked. Anakin's shoulders dropped half an inch. Not relaxation, nothing about this. Young man suggested he was capable of relaxation, but a fractional reduction in the particular tension that was about to get him killed. You don't know that, he said quietly. I know you need a biobed more than you need an argument. She gestured to the medical team that had followed her in, Nurse Ogawa and a second-year resident named Stoltz, and between the three of them, they guided Anakin off the pad with the particular choreography of medical professionals who had learned to move injured people without asking permission, because asking permission was how you lost them. He let them. That surprised her. The fury didn't leave his eyes, but something else moved behind it. Exhaustion, perhaps, or the pragmatic intelligence of someone who understood, on some level, that the woman with the medical scanner was not his enemy. Sickbay was 40 meters and 1 turbolift away. Beverly talked the entire time. Not because she thought conversation would calm him. Clearly nothing was going to calm him. But because monitoring his verbal responses gave her real-time neurological data and kept his attention on her rather than on the impulse to escape. The amputation was caused by an energy blade of some kind, she said, studying her tricorder as they moved through the corridor. Anakin's head turned sharply at that. The cauterization is actually clean, cleaner than a surgical cut. In some respects, that's slowing the blood loss. But the nerve endings along the residual limb are firing continuously, which means you're in significantly more pain than you're showing. And shock is setting in at the cellular level. How do you know what caused it, he asked. His voice had changed, still guarded, still tight, but curious in spite of itself. Your wound tells a story. Wounds always do. She glanced at him. What was it? The weapon? A long pause. A lightsaber. She had no frame of reference for that word. She cataloged it. And the being that used it. Count Dooku. The name came out flat and hard, wrapped in something that Beverly's clinical instincts identified not as simple hatred, but as the specific anguish of a young person who had encountered evil they were not yet equipped to defeat. That was a wound she couldn't treat with a dermal regenerator. Sickbay doors opened. Beverly guided him to the primary biobed and watched him take in the room. The clean lines, the soft lighting calibrated for medical calm, the equipment whose function he clearly could not identify, with the rapid, tactical assessment of someone trained to read environments for threats. He found none. His shoulders dropped another fraction. Lie back, Beverly said. He didn't. He sat on the edge of the biobed and looked at her with those blue eyes that were doing three things simultaneously: evaluating her trustworthiness, calculating his options, and failing to fully conceal the pain that was becoming difficult to manage. "What are you going to do?" Beverly pulled a stool to the bedside and sat, bringing herself to eye level with him. It was a technique she had learned early in her career, that the fastest way to earn a frightened patient's cooperation was to stop looming over them. She met his gaze directly. "The honest answer," she said, "is that I don't entirely know yet. Your physiology is mostly human baseline, which means I have frameworks to work from. The wound site needs cleaning, the nerve damage needs addressing, and the blood loss needs to be corrected before anything else. After that, I need to assess whether reconstruction is possible." Something moved across his face at the word reconstruction, a flicker of something that might, in a less controlled young man, have been hope. "The arm," he said carefully. "You mean the arm." "I mean the arm." He studied her for a long moment. Outside, through the viewport above the secondary biobed, the battle above Geonosis continued its slow, terrible arithmetic of fire and debris. Neither of them looked at it. "You pulled me off that planet," Anakin said, "in the middle of a battle." "What?" Beverly picked up a hypospray, analgesic, carefully calibrated, and held it where he could see it before she used it. Transparency. Always transparency with the ones who needed control. "Because you were dying and I'm a doctor." She administered the hypospray gently against his neck. "That's the entire reason. There's no other calculation involved." He absorbed this slowly, the way someone absorbs a concept that their experience has not prepared them to trust. Then, with the careful deliberateness of someone making a decision they aren't certain about, Anakin Skywalker lay back on the biobed. Beverly got to work. The biobed monitors sang their quiet, continuous data song above Anakin's head, and Beverly had learned to hear that song the way musicians hear individual instruments. In an orchestra, each tone distinct, each fluctuation meaningful, the whole composition telling her things about her patient that words never could. What the monitors were telling her now was simultaneously reassuring and deeply strange. His cardiovascular system was responding well to the plasma infusion, blood pressure climbing back towards sustainable. The analgesic had taken the sharpest edge off the pain, which meant the furrow between his brows had eased slightly, though his jaw remained set in that particular configuration she was beginning to recognize as his default expression, the face of someone who had learned early that showing vulnerability was a luxury they could not afford. But the other readings, those were something else entirely. "Nurse Ogawa," Beverly said quietly, not looking up from the wound site, where she was carefully clearing carbonized tissue with a cellular regenerator. "Are you seeing what I'm seeing on the biometric overlay?" Alyssa Ogawa leaned over the secondary display, and Beverly heard the small intake of breath that meant yes, she was seeing it. "The cellular density readings," Ogawa said. "There. Is that a calibration error?" "I recalibrated twice before we left the transporter room." Beverly adjusted the regenerator's frequency, working along the clean edge of the amputation site where Dooku's blade had severed the limb with terrible precision. "It's not an error. Anakin's cells, every cell in his body, not just the traumatized tissue of his wound, were saturated with the same bioenergetic field that data had detected permeating this entire region of space. Not contaminated by it, not affected by it, but generating it, producing it from within, the way a warp core generated plasma, continuously, naturally, as a function of simply being alive. The concentration in his tissue was orders of magnitude higher than the background field reading that filled this galaxy, like a second atmosphere. In 40 years of medicine, Beverly Crusher had never seen anything like it. She kept her voice clinical, kept her hands steady, kept her focus on the wound. "What's your name?" she asked her patient. "Anakin." A pause, as though he were deciding whether last names were relevant. "Anakin Skywalker." "Anakin, I'm going to be honest with you about something, because I think you're the kind of person who responds better to honesty than to careful management." She glanced up briefly, caught his eyes. "Your physiology is producing an energy field that my instruments cannot fully classify. It's not dangerous, at least not to you, and not to my crew, but it's unlike anything in my medical database. I want you to know that I'm aware of it, that I'm monitoring it, and that it won't change my approach to treating you." He was very still for a moment. "You can measure it. Imprecisely. But yes." Something in his expression shifted, not quite surprise, more the particular alertness of someone who has been told something they already knew but had never heard confirmed by an outside source. "The Force," he said. "Is that what you call it?" "It's what it is." He seemed to be deciding something. "You really don't know what it is." "I really don't." Beverly returned her attention to the wound site. "Tell me." What followed was one of the stranger medical consultations of Beverly's career, her patient describing, in the careful language of someone who had grown up with a concept so fundamental they had never been required to explain it from first principles, the nature of a bioenergetic field that connected all living things in this galaxy and could be perceived, channeled, and directed by those with sufficient cellular saturation. Beverly listened without interruption, the way she had been trained to listen, storing everything without judgment, because judgment was not medicine. When he finished, she said, "The beings you call Jedi, you're one of them. A Padawan, an apprentice." Something darkened briefly in his voice on the word apprentice. "My master is Obi-Wan Kenobi. He was in the hangar when you took me." "Is he?" "I told you he was alive." Beverly sealed the last of the necrotic tissue and set down the regenerator. "I should be honest, I extrapolated that from sensor data. I identified multiple life signs in your location, several mobile, with the same energy signature you carry. I cannot guarantee which one is your master." Anakin sat up slightly, the movement automatic, instinctive. The monitors spiked. Beverly put a firm hand on his shoulder. 20 more minutes," she said. "The plasma infusion needs to complete, or you'll be back in shock before you reach the turbolift." 20 minutes, Anakin." He looked at her hand on his shoulder, then back at her face. Then he lay back down, and Beverly understood that this was not compliance. This was a calculated decision made by someone who was already thinking 3 steps ahead, and who had determined that 20 minutes of stillness served his objectives better than immediate action. Good, she thought. He's intelligent. Intelligent patients were easier to keep alive. The comm badge on her chest chirped. "Crusher, this is Picard." She tapped it. "Go ahead, Captain. We have a development. Several vessels from the larger fleet, the one using the spherical craft configurations, have broken from the main engagement and are holding position at approximately 400 kilometers. They appear to be observing us rather than engaging. Additionally, data has identified what appears to be a shuttle of some kind, departing the planet's surface on an intercept course with our position. Single occupant. The bioenergetic field signature is present." A brief pause. A strong one. Beverly looked at Anakin, who had gone very still in the particular way of someone using senses other than hearing to gather information. "Obi-Wan," he said softly, to no one in particular. "Captain, my patient is stable but not mobile. I'll be in sick bay." "Understood. I'll receive our visitor on the bridge." Picard out. The channel closed. Beverly turned back to the wound site and began the more delicate work. Nerve mapping. Preliminary assessment of what the cellular regenerator could accomplish versus what would require a more significant intervention. The stump was clean. The bone was sealed. The network of nerves that had once run down into a living hand now terminated in organized but frustrated clusters, firing signals into empty space. She had seen prosthetic integration before. Starfleet medicine had developed neural interface LEM replacement to a considerable art form. But Anakin's unusual cellular biology complicated every calculation. The bioenergetic field, the Force, ran through his nervous system like a secondary circulatory system. Any prosthetic integration would need to account for that field, would need to be permeable to it in ways that standard neural interfaces were never designed to accommodate. She pulled up the prosthetics database on her PADD and began reading with the focused velocity of a doctor who had already decided that unprecedented was not the same as impossible. "You're trying to figure out if you can give me a new hand," Anakin said. Beverly didn't look up. "I'm reading about whether the approach I have in mind will work with your specific physiology." And she set the PADD down and looked at him directly because he deserved directness. "The honest answer is that I don't know yet." Standard neural interface prosthetics work by integrating with the peripheral nervous system. Your nervous system carries an additional component that I've never worked with before. I need to understand it before I attempt the integration, or I risk creating a prosthetic that's physically attached but neurologically inert. She paused, which would be worse than nothing. He absorbed this. How long? To understand the field well enough to attempt integration safely? Days, at minimum. Possibly longer. She watched his face carefully. I know that's not what you want to hear. My people have prosthetics, he said. Mechanical ones. I've seen them. I know. And that may be the path we take. But I want to explore every option before we settle for adequate when we might achieve something better. She picked up the PADD again. You said the force runs through all living things. Can you feel it in my crew? In me? The question caught him slightly off guard. He considered it with an honesty that suggested the question genuinely interested him. Faintly. He paused, searching for language that bridged two entirely different frameworks of understanding. You're present in it. Everyone on this ship is. But it's quiet, like hearing voices through a wall. He looked at his right arm, at the place where his hand had been. Obi-Wan always said I feel things too loudly. Beverly made a note in his medical file. Not a clinical note, a human one. Patient demonstrates exceptional intelligence. Controlled emotional presentation, masking significant internal distress. Responds to directness and respects competence. Trust is available, but must be earned in increments. Handle accordingly. She looked up at the viewport, where Geonosis still burned in the middle distance, and thought about the cascade of consequences that had begun the moment she asked Tef to energize. Above them, on the bridge, Jean-Luc Picard was about to meet a Jedi Knight for the first time. She almost wished she could be there to see it. Obi-Wan Kenobi had negotiated with separatist senators, reasoned with bounty hunters, and once talked a Mandalorian warlord down from a declaration of war using nothing but patience and precisely chosen words. He was, by any measure, a man who understood the architecture of diplomacy, how to read a room, how to find the frequency on which any sentient being could be reached, how to project calm as both a shield and an offering. He had never been brought aboard a vessel that appeared from nowhere, defied every sensor reading the Republic's technology could produce, and radiated an energy signature that the Force perceived as entirely, bewilderingly neutral. Not dark, not light, simply present, observing, like a mirror held up to the galaxy. The shuttle the Republic forces had provided was a small, practical craft, and Obi-Wan had spent the short transit from Geonosis's surface to the strange vessels, coordinates doing what he always did in uncertain situations, breathing, centering, listening to the Force. What the Force gave him was not danger, precisely. It was complexity, a sense of something vast and considered on the other end of this encounter. And beneath it, like a thread he could follow through any darkness, the unmistakable presence of Anakin, dimmed by pain, muted by whatever medicine these strangers had administered, but alive. Alive and, astonishingly, calmer than Obi-Wan had felt him in days. Whatever they had done for his Padawan, they had at least done that. The docking bay of the Enterprise was enormous by Republic standards and spotlessly, almost aggressively clean. The lighting was even and white and cast no shadows that Obi-Wan could identify, which his instincts found mildly disorienting in the way that any perfectly controlled environment did. Nature did not produce this kind of precision. Whoever these people were, they had mastered their technology to a degree that spoke of centuries of careful, systematic development. A welcoming party waited at the base of his shuttle's ramp. 3 individuals. The one in the center was clearly the authority, not because of any insignia Obi-Wan recognized, but because of the way the other 2 oriented themselves relative to him. The slight deference in their posture that spoke of genuine respect rather than performed hierarchy. He was of medium height, bald, with a bearing so precisely calibrated between military and diplomatic that Obi-Wan found himself immediately and involuntarily impressed. Beside him stood a tall, pale-skinned being of extraordinary stillness. Something about the quality of his presence suggested to Obi-Wan's Force senses that he was different from the others in a way he could not immediately define, and a Betazoid woman whose emotional sensitivity was immediately apparent in the Wei Shi looked at Obi-Wan with an expression of careful, professional compassion. Master Kenobi, said the man in the center. I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise. Welcome aboard. Obi-Wan descended the ramp with his hands visible and open, a gesture of peace old enough that he suspected it might be universal. Captain Picard. He took in the man's face, the intelligence there, the caution, the deeply ingrained sense of ethical responsibility that radiated from him as clearly as the Force radiated from a Jedi. You know my name. Your companion mentioned it. He's with our chief medical officer. He's stable. She wanted me to tell you that immediately. Something eased in Obi-Wan's chest that he hadn't fully acknowledged was tense. I'm grateful, though I confess I'm not certain whether to be grateful or alarmed that you were able to take him from the planet's surface without a ship making physical contact. A transporter, Picard said. Matter-energy conversion and rematerialization. I understand it sounds alarming if you haven't encountered it before. I assure you, your companion is entirely intact. A slight pause, the kind that preceded careful phrasing. More or less. His hand. Our doctor is assessing options. Obi-Wan nodded slowly. He studied Picard the way he studied every significant figure he encountered, not with suspicion, but with the Jedi's particular form of comprehensive attention, the attempt to understand, not just what someone said, but who they were beneath the saying of it. What he found was a man of deep principle navigating circumstances that had confounded those principles before he had even had time to articulate them. The prime directive, whatever that meant in the context of these people, was already in tension with the act of bringing Anakin aboard. Picard knew it. Obi-Wan could feel the weight of it on him. You didn't want to bring him aboard, Obi-Wan said. It was not an accusation. Picard met his gaze steadily. My doctor did not leave me a great deal of time to deliberate, and yet you allowed it. The alternative was allowing a young man to die. Picard's voice carried the particular flatness of someone who has made a decision they believe in, but whose implications they are still working through. Whatever complications that creates, I find I can live with that choice more easily than the other one. Obi-Wan almost smiled. You'd have made a reasonable Jedi, Captain. Something moved behind Picard's eyes that might have been amusement, might have been a more complicated response. Counselor Troy tells me you carry the same energy signature as your companion, what you referred to as the Force, that it's perceptible to her empathic senses. Obi-Wan glanced at the Betazoid woman, who was watching him with the careful, non-invasive attention of someone trained to receive rather than probe. He gave her a small acknowledging nod. The Force is perceptible to those sensitive to it. You have empaths among your people. Several species within our Federation have telepathic or empathic abilities. Yes. Picard gestured toward a corridor. Will you walk with me, Master Kenobi? I find I think better in motion, and we have a considerable amount to discuss. They walked. The tall, pale being, Data, Picard introduced him, and explained his nature with a directness that Obi-Wan appreciated, fell into step on. Picard's other side, a PADD in hand, ready to contribute precision wherever the conversation required it. Troy followed at a respectful distance. You're not from this galaxy, Obi-Wan said. It was not a question. No. We arrived through what we believe was a dimensional rift, a crossing between parallel universes, or distinct regions of a larger multiverse. The mechanics are not fully understood. Picard glanced at him. Does that concept exist in your experience? Theoretically, the Force touches all living things across time as well as space. There are traditions within the Jedi Order that speak of other planes of existence. He paused. Though I confess most of my colleagues treat those traditions as philosophical rather than literal. Science and philosophy have a way of colliding at the boundaries of what's known. Picard said, in my experience, the collision is usually productive. They reached what Obi-Wan understood to be a conference room, a long table, viewports along one wall looking out at Geonosis and the residual chaos of the battle, now largely concluded far below. The clone army had done its work. The Separatists were retreating or destroyed. A war had begun down there while they stood in this clean, quiet room, and the distance between the viewport and the surface felt very thin suddenly. The vessels that were observing you, Obi-Wan said, taking a seat across from Picard. The spherical ones. They've moved off. They withdrew approximately 40 minutes ago. We don't know why. Picard folded his hands on the table. Master Kenobi, I need to be honest with you about our situation. We are displaced from our own universe. We have no guaranteed method of returning. We have no mandate to involve ourselves in the political or military affairs of civilizations we encounter. In fact, we operate under a principle specifically prohibiting that kind of interference. He paused. That principle is already under significant strain. Given that my doctor has your companion in our sick bay, given that your doctor saved his life, Obi-Wan said evenly. Yes. Picard acknowledged this without deflection. I won't pretend the distinction is clean. It isn't. What I need to understand is what our presence here means for your conflict, for your civilization, and for our ability to resolve our own situation without causing harm we don't intend. Obi-Wan looked out the viewport at the burning planet below, at the place where a republic had just fought its first battle, where a war had just begun that he already understood, with the cold clarity the Force, sometimes granted without mercy, was going to be long and terrible and costly in ways they had not yet begun to count. What you've walked into, he said quietly, is the beginning of something very large. I'm not certain even I fully understand its scope yet. He turned back to Picard. But I think you should know the being your doctor is treating Anakin Skywalker. He chose his next words with the precision of someone who had learned that certain truths, spoken in certain rooms, changed the shape of everything that followed. He is not simply a soldier or a casualty of this battle. He is, according to prophecy, according to everything the Force has suggested, to those of us who can feel it, perhaps the most significant individual alive in this galaxy right now. Picard was quiet for a moment. And your doctor has him in sick bay. Your doctor, Obi-Wan corrected gently, saved his life. Which means whatever comes next. Captain, you and I are already part of each other's stories. He met Picard's gaze with the calm certainty of a man who had learned to trust the Force even when it led him somewhere he hadn't expected. The only question remaining is what kind of part we choose to play. Picard held his gaze for a long moment. Then, with the particular decisiveness of a man who had made peace with complexity, he reached for the comm panel on the table. Data, he said. Begin a full analysis of the dimensional rift's residual signature. I want to know if we can find our way home. He released the panel. Looked back at Obi-Wan. And in the meantime, tell me about this war. Data's analysis of the rift's residual signature took 4.7 hours, which by the android's own assessment was either an encouraging sign or a deeply concerning one, depending on how one interpreted the preliminary results. The quantum variance patterns were degrading the dimensional boundary that had deposited the Enterprise E in this galaxy was not holding its shape the way naturally occurring anomalies typically did. It was collapsing inward, slowly but measurably, like a wound closing over itself. In approximately 72 hours, Data projected with his characteristic precision, the residual signature would be insufficient to serve as a navigational reference for any attempt to reopen the crossing. 72 hours. 3 days. Picard absorbed this information in his ready room with the stillness of a man who had learned that panic was simply wasted energy wearing an urgent face. He read Data's report twice, set it down, and looked out the viewport at the stars of a galaxy that was not his own. Then he picked up the report and read it a third time. Because Picard believed that important information deserved multiple readings, that the mind found different things on each pass. What he found on the third pass was a detail Data had flagged in a subordinate clause, almost as an aside, the kind of notation the android included because completeness was a moral principle for him, rather than a stylistic choice. The rift's degradation was not entirely natural. Someone was accelerating it. Picard was already reaching for his comm badge when Worf's voice came through shipwide. Captain, to the bridge. We have incoming vessels. Configuration unknown. The view screen showed 3 ships holding position at 80 kilometers, close enough to be deliberate, far enough to avoid triggering automatic defensive protocols. They were unlike anything the Enterprise ES database contained, which was itself no longer surprising. What was surprising was their design philosophy. Were the Republic and Separatist vessels Picard had observed during the battle carried the functional, purposeful aesthetics of military engineering. These ships were something different, elegant in a way that suggested age, not primitive age, but the kind of refinement that came from a civilization that had been building starships long enough to have forgotten what the early, ungainly prototypes looked like. Curved hulls, dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and no visible weapons, which Worf correctly identified as either reassuring or the most sophisticated threat posture he had ever encountered. Energy readings? Picard asked. Significant, Worf said, his voice carrying the specific register of professional respect for a potential opponent. Reactor output on the lead vessel exceeds our own by approximately 30%. Weapons systems are present but not powered. Shields are active, different technology from anything we've cataloged. But the functional profile is consistent with defensive shielding. A pause. They are hailing us, Captain. Tight beam transmission, encrypted, but the universal translator is working on it. How long? It decoded 11 seconds ago, Data said from Ops. I was waiting for an appropriate moment to report. The message is brief. It reads, "We have been watching since your arrival. We know what you carry. We wish to discuss the Skywalker boy. Come alone, Captain, or do not come at all." The bridge absorbed this. They were the ones observing us earlier, Troy said. The spherical vessels that withdrew. She was studying the ships on the view screen with an expression of careful unease. "I can feel them, Captain. Faintly, they're force-sensitive, like Obi-Wan and Anakin, but differently. The emotional signature is..." She searched for the word. "Colder. More controlled. It doesn't feel malevolent, but it doesn't feel neutral either. There's calculation there. Very old calculation." Picard turned to the science station. "Can you identify the species?" "Negative," Data said. However, cross-referencing the ship design philosophy with the cultural information Master Kenobi provided during his briefing suggests a possibility. He mentioned a group called the Separatists employ a range of alien species within their technical and command structures. However, the design language here does not match Separatist profiles. He paused in the particular way that meant he was making a connection that others had not yet reached. Master Kenobi also referenced, briefly and with some reluctance, a tradition of force-sensitive beings who operate outside the Jedi Order structure. He declined to elaborate in detail. Picard stood. "Get Master Kenobi." Obi-Wan identified the ships before the viewscreen image had fully resolved. He stood very still for a moment with his hands folded inside his robe, and Picard, watching him, saw the Jedi Master perform a rapid internal calculation that moved across his face in fragments too brief to fully read. Recognition, concern, the particular compression of expression that meant someone was deciding how much to say. "Separatists?" Picard asked. "No." Obi-Wan's voice was carefully level. "Those are not separatist vessels." He turned from the view screen. "Captain, I need to know exactly what their message said." Picard nodded to Data, who repeated it verbatim. Obi-Wan listened without expression, which was itself an expression. "They know about Anakin," he said. "Evidently. Who are they?" A long pause. "There are traditions within the Force, older than the Jedi Order, older than the Republic itself, that chose different paths than the one the Order follows. Some of those traditions have maintained their distance from galactic affairs for centuries. They observe. They record. They involve themselves rarely, and only when they believe the stakes justify the interruption of their isolation." He looked back at the ships. "The fact that they're here, now, speaking of Anakin specifically, suggests that his arrival aboard your ship has been noticed by sources that monitor the Force itself rather than political events. Are they dangerous? Everything with sufficient power and sufficient motivation is dangerous," Obi-Wan said, with the pragmatism of a man who had stopped, finding that observation troubling. "Decades ago. But they aren't our enemies. At least, they weren't the last time the Order had contact with them, which was approximately 200 years ago." "That's a meaningful qualifier," Picard noted. "Yes, it is." Beverly had not been informed of the new development because Beverly was occupied, and when Beverly was occupied in a medical context, the standing instruction from every senior officer who had ever served with her was to allow her to remain occupied unless the ship was actively breaking apart. She was 3 hours into a procedure that she had designed herself, in real time, without a precedent in any medical database she could access, and she needed every fraction of her attention where it was. The neural mapping had taken 2 hours. The force, she had started thinking of it in capital letters. Somewhere around hour 1. Because the data demanded that kind of respect, ran through Anakin's nervous system in patterns that were simultaneously completely alien and strangely logical. It followed the neural pathways the way electricity followed conductive material, concentrating in the peripheral nervous system, amplifying at the major ganglia, and reaching its highest density in the brain's limbic system, which explains certain things about her patient's emotional presentation that she was filing away for later consideration. The prosthetic interface was the challenge. Standard neural interface prosthetics worked by establishing a bidirectional signal bridge between the patient's existing neural architecture and the prosthetics sensor-motor network. The patient's nervous system learned to treat the prosthetic as an extension of itself through repeated use neural pathway reinforcement, the same mechanism by which any learned physical skill became automatic. It was elegant, proven technology, and it would not work as designed with Anakin's nervous system because his nervous system was doing something additional that the interface was not designed to accommodate. If she attempted standard integration, the force field would treat the prosthetics signal bridge as interference and route around it, leaving the prosthetic physically attached but neurologically isolated. She had confirmed this through simulation before touching him. What she needed was an interface that didn't fight the field, one that incorporated it, used it as part of the signal pathway rather than competing with it. She had spent an hour designing it on her PADD while Anakin slept. The analgesics had finally overcome his resistance to rest, and another hour arguing with the replicator about material tolerances for a neural interface architecture that had never been manufactured before. The replicator, to its credit, had produced something workable on the 3rd attempt. She was mid-procedure when Anakin woke. She knew he was awake before he moved, because the biometric readings shifted in the particular way they did when his consciousness reasserted itself, a subtle amplification of the force field readings, as though awareness itself increased his output. "Don't move," she said, without looking up. "I'm working on the interface architecture, and I need the residual limb completely still." "What are you doing?" His voice was rough from sleep and analgesics, but alert. "Building you a bridge." She made a micro-adjustment to the interface placement. The force field in your nervous system would reject a standard prosthetic signal pathway, so I'm designing one that incorporates the field rather than working around it. The interface will use your own bioenergetic output as part of the signal carrier. She paused. "I want to be clear that I've never done this before." Silence. "Then, that's either reassuring or terrifying." "Probably both," Beverly said. "Stay still." He stayed still. Outside, 3 dark ships held their position and waited, patient as old stone, for Jean-Luc Picard to make a decision about a meeting that Beverly didn't yet know was happening. And in sickbay, underneath Beverly's careful hands, the first neural interface prosthetic ever designed to carry the force began to take shape. Picard did not go alone. He had considered it. The message had been specific, and Picard understood that specific instructions from unknown parties carried information about the psychology of those issuing them. Come alone meant they wanted control of the encounter's variables. It meant they were cautious. It meant, paradoxically, that they were probably not planning violence. Because beings planning violence did not generally request intimate meetings with a single starship captain when they had the firepower to simply take what they wanted. But Picard had also commanded starships long enough to know that considered it and acted on it were 2 very different things, and that the wisdom of 30 years in space could be distilled into a single principle. You did not walk into an unknown room without someone knowing where you were and what to do if you didn't come back. He took Troy. Her empathic senses were the closest thing to a biological sensor array he could bring into a meeting where standard tricorder readings might be limited or deliberately obscured. He took Worf because Worf's presence communicated something about the Enterprise ES character that words alone could not, that this was a vessel that understood the language of strength without being defined by it. And he took Obi-Wan Because whatever these beings wanted to discuss about Anakin Skywalker, his master had earned the right to be present for that conversation. The lead vessel received them in a docking bay that made the Enterprise ES look functional by comparison. Everything here was deliberate: the proportions of the space, the quality of the light, the materials underfoot that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. Whoever had designed this ship had understood that environments shaped thought, that architecture was a form of argument. Picard found himself in the presence of aesthetics he deeply respected and was correspondingly more alert for it. Their hosts were three in number. Two were robed figures whose species Picard could not immediately identify, tall, still, with the quality of presence that Obi-Wan carried, but older, more compressed, as though decades of discipline had reduced something enormous to a very dense, very quiet point. The third was different. She was seated rather than standing, and older than the others by a measure. That showed not in any physical frailty, but in the absolute economy of her movements. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. Every gesture carrying exactly the weight it intended to carry, and no more. She looked at Picard with eyes that were cataloging him with the same comprehensive attention he was giving her. And she looked at Obi-Wan with something that might have been recognition, might have been assessment, and might have been both simultaneously. She looked at the space beside Obi-Wan, the space where Anakin was, not with an expression so carefully controlled that its very control communicated something profound. "Captain Picard," she said. Her voice was accented in a way the universal translator smoothed, but did not entirely eliminate, leaving a texture underneath the words that suggested a language of considerable antiquity. "I am called Daughter of the Beforetime in your translation. My companions require no introduction for our purposes." She gestured toward the low seats, arranged across from her own. "Please." They sat. Worf remained standing, which Picard permitted because Worf remaining standing was itself a communication. He was comfortable sending. "You know why we're here," Picard said. It was not a question. "We know why you are there," she said, gesturing upward in a direction that clearly indicated the Enterprise E above them. "The rift that deposited you in our galaxy was not entirely accidental. The Force does not produce accidents of this magnitude. You're suggesting the Force specifically arranged for our arrival. I'm suggesting that the Force moves through living things, and that sometimes living things make choices whose cumulative weight creates what appears, from outside, to look like coincidence." She folded her hands in her lap with the precision of someone for whom every physical arrangement was a considered decision. "The Skywalker boy. Your doctor has him. She's treating him," Picard said carefully. "She is doing considerably more than treating him." The ancient woman's eyes moved to Obi-Wan. "You felt it, surely, on the shuttle, the quality of his presence." Obi-Wan was quiet for a moment. "He was calmer than I expected," he said. "Given the circumstances, he was calmer than he has been in years," she said. "Perhaps longer." Something moved through her expression, not sentiment exactly, but an acknowledgement of weight. "Your doctor speaks to him as though his pain is simply a problem to be solved, as though his anger is information rather than verdict, as though he is, in the final accounting, simply a young man who needs competent care." She paused. "You cannot imagine how rare that is. For him specifically." Troy shifted slightly in her seat, and Picard read the movement. Without looking at her, she was receiving something significant from the ancient woman. He would ask her about it later. "What is it you want from us?" Picard asked. "We want you to understand what you are holding." She leaned forward very slightly, that fraction of movement carrying the same weight as a larger gesture would from anyone else. "The Skywalker boy is not simply a gifted Force user, Captain. He is the axis around which the next several decades of this galaxy's history will turn. The prophecy is older than the Republic, older than the Jedi Order as it currently exists, and it has been debated and reinterpreted and argued over for generations. But the Force does not debate. The Force simply is." She looked directly at Picard. "What your doctor does for him in the next 48 hours, what she says to him, what she gives him, what she allows him to believe about himself, will matter, Captain, in ways that extend far beyond one young man's medical recovery." The conference room absorbed this. Worf was very still behind Picard, the stillness of a warrior who had recognized that the current threat was not physical and was recalibrating accordingly. With respect, Picard said, keeping his voice level and his phrasing precise. Because this situation demanded both. My doctor treats her patients as individuals, not as instruments of prophecy, not as historical forces, not as variables in a calculation. As people, he held the ancient woman's gaze. I would not have her do otherwise. Something crossed her face that might, if he was reading her correctly, have been approval. No, she said. I don't imagine you would. She sat back. We are not asking you to change what she does. We are asking you to understand its significance. And the rift, Picard said. Your people are accelerating its degradation. The silence that followed was half a second too long to be natural. You detected that, she said. Not a question. A reassessment. My science officer is. Thorough. Picard's voice did not change in tone or temperature. I would like to understand why. She studied him for a long moment with those cataloging eyes. Because your presence here is a disruption, Captain. A significant one. The Force has brought you here for a purpose. And when that purpose is complete, you should not remain. The longer you stay, the more deeply you become, woven into events that are not yours to shape. She paused. We are not destroying your path home. We are preserving it, at the cost of making it time-limited. 72 hours, Picard said. Approximately. Yes. Obi-Wan spoke for the first time since sitting down. What happens to Anakin when they leave? His voice was quiet but carried the particular quality of a question asked by someone who had already considered the answer and found it troubling. The ancient woman looked at him with an expression of genuine compassion, the first unguarded emotion she had shown. That depends, she said, on what your doctor manages to give him before they go. She looked at her folded hands. And on what he manages to give himself. Troy leaned forward slightly. You're afraid for him, she said softly. Genuinely afraid. The ancient woman looked at the Betazoid for a long moment. The Force shows us possibilities, counselor, not certainties. What I have seen for the Skywalker boy, what he may become, if certain things are not. She stopped, chose her next word with surgical care. Addressed. It is the source of considerable concern among those of us who watch. Picard looked at Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan was looking at his own hands, and his expression was the expression of a man hearing something confirmed that he had hoped to be wrong about. What do you need from us? Picard asked. Nothing, she said. Only that you not waste the time you have. Back aboard the Enterprise E, Beverly Crusher was completing the neural interface installation and preparing to activate it for the first time. She had no idea that three ancient, Force-sensitive beings in a dark ship 400 kilometers away were, in their own austere fashion, holding their breath. She activated the interface. The biobed monitors spiked across every channel. Simultaneously, a full system response that made Ogawa reach for the emergency protocols before. Beverly's raised hand stopped her. She watched the readings cascade through their initial chaos. Watched the force field in Anakin's nervous system encounter the new pathway. Probe it. Test it the way water tests a new channel. And then, with a naturalness that Beverly found quietly extraordinary, flow into it. Anakin's eyes opened. He lay completely still for 3 seconds, which, Beverly had already learned, was his way of processing something significant. Then he raised his right arm slowly, turned it, looked at the prosthetic hand at the end of it with an expression that moved through disbelief into something she could not quite name. He closed the hand into a fist, opened it, closed it again. I can feel it, he said. His voice was very quiet. The Force. Through the hand. I can feel it. Beverly allowed herself one moment of profound professional satisfaction. Then she picked up her tricorder and went back to work. Because there were calibrations to verify, and the moment deserved to be honored with precision rather than ceremony. Good, she said simply. Tell me if anything feels wrong. He turned his head to look at her. The blue eyes were doing something new, something that wasn't fury or calculation or controlled grief. Something that Beverly, who had raised a son and loved people across decades of extraordinary circumstances, recognized with the practiced ease of long experience. It was gratitude, unguarded, undefended, and clearly unfamiliar on his face, like a word in a language he knew but rarely spoke. Thank you, Anakin Skywalker said. Beverly met his gaze briefly and nodded once. Because she understood instinctively that this young man did not need her to make more of the moment than it was. He needed it to be real and simple and enough. "You're welcome," she said, and returned to her readings. The mess hall of the Enterprise was not, strictly speaking, a diplomatic venue. It had no conference table, no formal seating arrangement, no view screen calibrated for presentations of strategic import. It had replicators producing food at all hours, large viewports that looked out at whatever stars the ship happened to be passing, and a quality of informal ease that Picard had always believed was one of the most underrated features of a well-run starship. The understanding that important conversations did not always require important rooms, that sometimes the most consequential things were said over coffee in a place where the lighting was warm and no one was performing authority at anyone else. He had brought Obi-Wan here deliberately. The Jedi Master sat across from him with a cup of something the replicator had produced. At his hesitant request, tea, though the blend was Picard's suggestion, an Earl Grey that he had softened to something lighter in deference to a guest whose tastes he did not yet know. Obi-Wan had accepted it with the courtesy of a diplomat and was drinking it with what appeared to be genuine appreciation, which Picard found encouraging. Shared pleasures, however small, were the foundation of trust between strangers. "She said what he may become," Picard said. He had been turning the ancient woman's words over since they left her ship, examining them from different angles, the way he examined artifacts, looking for what the surface concealed. Not what he is, what he may become. "Yes," Obi-Wan said. He was looking at his tea. "You understood what she meant." A long pause, the kind that Picard recognized not as evasion, but as the careful assembly of something that the speaker had been carrying alone and was not certain how to set down in front of another person. "The Force," Obi-Wan said finally, "does not show the Jedi the future in clear images. It shows tendencies, pressures, the weight of accumulated choices, pressing in a particular direction." He turned his cup slowly in his hands. He is extraordinary. In the history of the Jedi Order, there have been perhaps a handful of individuals with his connection to the Force. His potential is genuinely without precedent in living memory." He paused again. "Potential is not the same as outcome." "His anger," Picard said quietly. Obi-Wan looked up. "You've seen it." Beverly described her patient to me in medical terms. The clinical language was precise and careful and told me everything I needed to know. Picard held his cup with both hands, a habit from years of cold bridge shifts. A young man with exceptional ability, intense emotional responses he's learned to suppress rather than process, and a history that has required him to develop self-sufficiency as a survival mechanism rather than a choice. He met Obi-Wan's gaze. "In my experience, that particular combination does not resolve itself without intervention." Obi-Wan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone finally saying aloud something that had lived in them for a long time. "I am not certain I have always been the right person to provide that intervention. I care for him deeply. He knows that, I believe, or I hope he does. But the Jedi tradition, in which I trained, emphasizes." He searched for the word. "Detachment. The release of attachment as a path to clarity. I believe in that teaching. I have found it true in my own experience." He set his cup down. "I am less certain it is the right teaching for Anakin specifically. His relationship with attachment, with love, with connection, with the people and things he fears to lose, is not a weakness to be excised. It is the source of his greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability simultaneously. And I have not always known how to help him hold both truths at once." Picard looked at him for a long moment. "Have you told him this?" "Which part?" "Any of it." Obi-Wan smiled, small, rueful, genuinely fond. "Jedi Masters are not, as a rule, trained in the explicit articulation of doubt." "No," Picard said. "Neither are starship captains." He looked out the viewport. "We learn, or we lose people." In sickbay, Anakin was learning the hand. Beverly had given him a series of calibration exercises, not because the neural interface required them. It was functioning at 93% efficiency on its first activation, which was frankly extraordinary, but because she understood that the psychological integration of a prosthetic was as important as the physiological one. The mind needed to learn to trust a new part of itself. That learning happened through use, through repetition, through the gradual accumulation of evidence that the new thing was reliable. She had given him a small object, a medical stylus, smooth, cylindrical, light. She had asked him to pick it up, set it down, pick it up again. He had been doing this for 20 minutes with the focused intensity of someone for whom mastery was not a goal but a baseline expectation of himself. The hand was performing beyond her projections. The force-integrated signal pathway was not just carrying motor commands, it was amplifying proprioceptive feedback in ways that standard prosthetics could not replicate, giving him a tactile sensitivity in the new hand that some of her reports suggested was actually superior to biological sensation in certain respects. She was documenting everything with the rigor of someone who understood that this procedure, whatever its immediate purpose, was going to matter to medicine in ways that extended far beyond this patient. "You're well past the calibration threshold," she said, watching him set the stylus down with a precision that was beginning to shade into deliberate understatement. "You can stop performing for my sensors." He looked up, caught something that was almost amusement crossed his face, a glimpse of a younger version of himself. She thought, someone who had not yet learned that humor was a vulnerability. "It's not for your sensors." "Then what is it for?" He considered this seriously, the way she had noticed he considered questions that he found genuinely interesting. "When I lost the hand," he said, "I lost something else. In the fight against Dooku." He set the stylus down very carefully. "I wasn't good enough. I went in angry and I was defeated because I was angry. And I knew it was anger and I went in anyway." He looked at the prosthetic hand. "The hand it's proof of a mistake. I want to understand it before I try to use it for anything that matters." Beverly set down her PADD. She pulled her stool close and sat, bringing herself to his level in the way she had learned he responded to. "Can I tell you what I observed when I was treating you?" He nodded. "Your anger is not separate from your ability," she said. "It runs through the same pathways. When your emotional responses are elevated, your bioenergetic output increases significantly. What you call the force amplifies, which means your anger makes you more powerful, not less." She paused. "The question isn't how to remove the anger. The question is what you do with the power it generates." He stared at her. "The Jedi teach that anger leads to the dark side." "I'm not a Jedi," Beverly said. "I'm a doctor. And what I see in your biosigns is a young man with an extraordinary capacity for feeling who has been told repeatedly that feeling is dangerous." She held his gaze. "Feeling isn't dangerous. Feeling without understanding is dangerous. Those are different problems with different solutions." The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that Beverly had learned to recognize after decades of medicine, the silence of someone encountering an idea that reorganized something fundamental in how they understood themselves. She did not fill it. She let it breathe. "My mother," Anakin said finally. His voice was very quiet. I lost her. Recently. I couldn't save her." He stopped. Started again. "I was angry then too. Afterward." He looked at his hands, both of them, with an expression of profound complexity that Beverly cataloged and did not press. "I did things I'm not. Afterward, I did things." Beverly kept her face and voice level, because this was the moment where clinical composure was an act of respect rather than distance. "You don't have to tell me what you did," she said, "but I want you to know that whatever it was, it doesn't define the full architecture of who you are. Actions taken in acute grief are not character verdicts." She paused. "Though they are information about what you need." "What do I need?" The question was raw. In a way his questions usually weren't. The defensiveness temporarily down, something underneath it asking with genuine urgency. Beverly considered her answer with the care it deserved. "Someone who isn't afraid of the size of what you carry," she said. "Someone who treats your pain as a problem to be solved, rather than a moral failing to be corrected." She met his gaze steadily. "You've been managing alone for a very long time. That's not strength, Anakin. That's a coping mechanism. They're not the same thing." The monitors showed his force field output at its highest recorded level since his arrival. Not a spike of anger or distress, but a sustained elevation, like a frequency finally finding its resonance. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then the ship shuddered. Not violently, not the concussive impact of weapons fire, but the particular resonant tremor of something large moving very close, displacing space with the mass of something that the structural integrity field noticed and reported through the hull as a kind of low, sustained vibration. Beverly was at the Biob's side station before the tremor finished, reading the external sensor feed that automatically routed to sickbay during anomalous events. What she saw made her reach for the comm badge with one hand while the other steadied Anakin's arm, the prosthetic arm, which had gripped the biobed railing with a force that left small impressions in the composite material. The spherical vessels that Picard's away team had visited were no longer 400 kilometers distant. They were 12, and behind them, dropping out of whatever faster-than-light travel this galaxy used, were 17 more ships that Beverly did not recognize, larger, angular, purposeful in the way that warships were. Purposeful, broadcasting a signal on all frequencies that the universal translator was rendering with cold, flat clarity. Surrender the vessel from the other place. Surrender the Skywalker boy. The Count will receive them personally. Dooku knew exactly where Anakin was. And Anakin, reading Beverly's expression with the perceptive accuracy of someone for whom reading people was as natural as breathing, was already sitting up, already reaching for the dark outer robe. Someone had folded on the chair beside the biobed, already becoming something other than a patient. How many ships? He asked. Beverly told him. He nodded once, with a calm that was not the absence of feeling but the presence of absolute purpose. And Beverly recognized it with a chill of professional clarity, as the calm of someone who had just been handed a reason to stop thinking about themselves. She reached for the calm. Crusher to bridge. Red alert. Picard was moving before the words fully left his mouth. The mess hall forgotten, the Earl Grey abandoned. The warm conversation, with Obi-Wan compressed into a memory he would return to later if there was a later. The corridors of the Enterprise at red alert had a particular quality, the lighting shift to deeper tones, the sound of boots on deck plating, the sensation of a vessel contracting around its purpose the way a fist closes. And Picard moved through it with the practiced ease of a man who had spent more of his life in emergencies than out of them. Obi-Wan kept pace beside him without being asked, which Picard noted and accepted. The Jedi Master's hand had moved to his lightsaber without his appearing to consciously decide it. The gesture as automatic as breathing, and he was doing something with his eyes that Picard had seen Troy do in moments of significant empathic input, a slight defocusing, a quality of attention turned partially inward, listening to something the rest of the bridge crew could not hear. 17 Separatist warships, Obi-Wan said quietly, as though confirming something he had already sensed. Dooku has significant resources at his disposal. He will have diverted them from the main battle, which means he considers this more important than the engagement at Geonosis. A pause. That should concern us. It does, Picard said. Deeply. The bridge received them at a run of controlled activity, every station occupied, every officer doing exactly what they were trained to do. The particular beautiful functionality of a well-drilled crew, encountering a crisis they had not anticipated but had nonetheless prepared for. Worf was already at tactical, his large hands moving across the console with the focused aggression of a Klingon warrior who was professionally delighted to have a clear threat to address. Report, Picard said, taking his chair. 17 vessels matching Separatist configuration. Range 60 kilometers and closing, Worf said. Additionally, the 3 vessels that hosted our away team have repositioned. They are now between us and the Separatist fleet, holding position, not engaging. He paused in a way that communicated professional respect for tactical complexity. The Separatist fleet is hailing us on all frequencies, Captain. The message is the same on each channel. I've heard the message, Picard said. He looked at the view screen, where the geometric precision of Separatist warships arranged themselves with the cold purposefulness of a closing trap. Analysis of their weapons configuration? Significant, Worf said, which from Worf meant genuinely formidable. Their primary weapons appear to be turbo-laser technology, directed energy, extremely high yield, continuous beam capability rather than pulse fire. Our shields will handle initial impacts. but sustained fire from multiple vessels simultaneously will present a problem. He looked up from his console with the expression of a Klingon who had done the mathematics and found them worthy of respect. They also carry complement of smaller fighter craft, droid-operated. No life signs aboard. Approximately 400 visible on sensors. Droid fighters, data said from Ops. Automated combat units. The absence of organic pilots removes certain tactical limitations. They will not hesitate, will not retreat from self-preservation instinct, and can coordinate at computational speeds. He turned. However, they rely on a central coordination signal. If that signal were disrupted, they would become individually autonomous. Picard finished. Less coordinated. He filed that. Options. We could engage, Worf said, with the tone of a man, presenting his preferred option. First, and acknowledging it might not be selected. Our weapons technology is significantly more precise than theirs. Photon torpedoes would be effective against their hull configurations. We are not starting a battle with 17 warships over a planet that is already fighting a war, Picard said flatly. What else? The dark vessels, Troy said from her station. She was watching the view screen with the focused expression of someone processing multiple emotional inputs simultaneously. They repositioned between us and the Separatist fleet deliberately. They're not fighting, but they're not neutral either. She paused. They're offering something. I can feel intent from them. It feels like protection, or at least the offer of it. Picard looked at Obi-Wan. Your ancient friends. They move in ways the Order does not always anticipate, Obi-Wan said carefully. But their interests align with ours in this specific situation. Dooku acquiring Anakin, or your technology, or both, is contrary to everything they value. Then they're a potential asset. Picard turned to Data. Open a channel to the lead dark vessel. The response came in 11 seconds, faster than the initial contact had been, which suggested urgency on their end as well. The ancient woman's voice came through the audio channel without visual, which Picard suspected was a deliberate choice. Captain Picard, you see the situation. I do. What can you offer? Time, she said. We can hold the Separatist fleet's advance, not indefinitely, and not without cost, but long enough for you to make decisions rather than simply react to them. A pause. What you do with that time is yours to determine. We will not fight your battle for you, but we will ensure you have the space to choose how to fight it. Understood. Picard closed the channel and turned to his crew. Data, the droid coordination signal. Can we disrupt it? With a precisely modulated subspace pulse, yes. The disruption would be temporary, perhaps 4 minutes before their backup. Coordination protocols. Re-establish, but during that window their fighter complement would be operating at significantly reduced effectiveness. Data tilted his head slightly. However, broadcasting the pulse would require lowering our forward shields for approximately 8 seconds. 8 seconds is a very long time, Worf observed. Yes, Data agreed pleasantly. It is. Picard looked at the view screen, looked at the 17 ships, looked at the 3 dark vessels holding the line between them with whatever their equivalent of shields was, and something about their stillness reminded him, absurdly, completely, of the ancient woman's folded hands, deliberate, considered, every gram of available presence deployed, with total economy. He made his decision. Worf, prepare photon torpedoes, targeting their weapons arrays, not their hulls. I want to disable, not destroy. He turned. Data, prepare the subspace pulse on my mark. Helm, get us a position behind the dark vessels, use them for cover. During the 8-second window, he stood, and someone tell Beverly Crusher to secure her patient. Beverly had already secured her patient, in the sense that she had attempted to. Anakin had listened to her, described the tactical situation, with the focused calm of someone conducting triage, sorting information by relevance, discarding what was not immediately actionable, identifying what was. When she finished, he had looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, and then said, I need to be on the bridge. You need to be in sickbay, Beverly said. Doctor. His voice was patient in the way that suggested patience was being applied deliberately to a situation that was testing it. There are 17 warships out there because of me. There are people on this ship who are in danger because of me. I am not going to lie in a bio bed while that is happening. Beverly looked at him, looked at the prosthetic hand, which was fully functional and fully integrated, and which he had, in the last 40 minutes, gone from picking up a stylus to gripping biobed railings hard enough to leave impressions. Looked at his face, which was showing her the version of himself he deployed when he had made a decision and was waiting for the world to catch up. She had lost this argument before it began. She had known that when she started it. She had started it anyway, because her job was to advocate for his physical well-being even when his physical well-being was not his primary concern, and because the 8 seconds between starting the argument and losing it had given her time to complete the last calibration, check on the neural interface, and verify that it would hold under stress. Stay out of the direct line of any weapons discharge, she said. If you take a hit, come back here immediately. And she handed him a small device, a medical monitor, designed to clip to clothing that would feed his biosigns directly to her station. Wear this. He looked at it, looked at her, took it and clipped it to the front of his robe with a precision that suggested he understood it was a compromise she had arrived at on his behalf, and that he was honoring that. Thank you, he said. Again, the words still sitting slightly unfamiliarly in his mouth, still carrying that quality of being a language he was learning to speak. Don't get shot, Beverly said. He almost smiled. Then he was moving, and Beverly turned back to her station and began preparing for casualties, with the focused efficiency of someone who hoped very much to have nothing to do. Anakin arrived on the bridge at the precise moment Picard said mark. The subspace pulse went out. The shields dropped for 8 seconds that Picard counted internally with the particular temporal awareness of a commander who had learned that seconds were the most expensive currency in space combat. The dark vessels absorbed 2 turbolaser impacts that would have hit the Enterprise ES unshielded forward section, their hulls dispersing the energy in ways that produced extraordinary, light but apparently minimal damage. Whatever those ships were made of, it was not standard materials. Then the shields came back up. The droid fighters stuttered, lost coordination, began moving in the confused patterns of individually autonomous units reorienting, without central direction. Worf fired, precise, targeted. The phaser arrays finding weapons emplacements on 3 separatist vessels with the accuracy of a gunner who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had prepared for it thoroughly. 3 vessels went dark at their weapons arrays. Not destroyed, disabled. The separatist fleet paused, not in retreat, in reassessment. The pause of a commander, recalibrating after the opening exchange, had not gone as projected. Into that pause stepped Anakin Skywalker, who had positioned himself beside the view screen and was looking at the separatist fleet with an expression of absolute, crystalline focus. Dooku is on one of those ships, he said. Not a question. Picard looked at him. Can you tell which one? Anakin was quiet for 3 seconds. The force field readings on Beverly's medical monitor, which she was watching from sickbay with the attention of a hawk, spiked to the highest level she had recorded. Yes, Anakin said. Picard studied him for a moment. This young man standing on his bridge, prosthetic hand at his side, looking at 17 enemy warships with the focused calm of someone who had found his purpose and was standing inside it. He thought about what Obi-Wan had said in the mess hall, about what the ancient woman had said in her dark ship, about what Beverly had not said but had communicated in every careful, precise, respectful interaction with her patient. He thought about a young man who had been told for years that his greatest capacity was also his greatest danger. Tell me, Picard said. The ship Anakin identified was the 3rd vessel, from the left in the Separatist formation's 2nd rank, a cruiser of considerable size, positioned with the deliberate modesty of a commander who understood that placing himself at the center of a formation was an invitation for precisely targeted responses. Dooku had not survived decades of galactic politics and Sith apprenticeship by making himself an obvious target. He sat in the 2nd rank, protected by the vessels ahead of him, close enough to direct the engagement with authority, far enough to preserve options. It was, Picard reflected, exactly what he would have done. Confirmed, Data said, his fingers moving across ops with the velocity of someone running 12 analyses simultaneously. The vessel Anakin indicates. Shows a power distribution consistent, with a command configuration rather than a standard combat cruiser. Primary shields are stronger than the surrounding vessels. Communications traffic originates disproportionately from that location. He looked up. Additionally, I am detecting a bioenergetic field signature aboard that vessel consistent with force sensitivity, distinct from Anakin's but significant in magnitude. Dooku, Obi-Wan said from his position near the tactical station. His voice was level in the way that Beverly's voice was level when she was managing something difficult, the levelness of professional discipline applied to personal feeling. He was a Jedi Master before he left the Order. His connection to the Force remains considerable, which means he can feel Anakin aboard this ship, Picard said. Almost certainly, and Anakin can feel him. Obi-Wan glanced at his Padawan, which is why he could locate the ship. Anakin said nothing. He was still looking at the view screen with that quality of absolute focus that Beverly had noted, and Picard was now observing directly. Focus of someone managing a very large internal force with very deliberate external stillness. The medical monitor clipped to his robe was broadcasting biosigns that Beverly, watching from sickbay, was reading with clinical alarm she was professionally containing. The force field output was not a spike, it was a sustained elevation, at a level she had not previously recorded, like a reactor running at maximum rated power without safety governors engaged. The Separatist fleet had not resumed its advance. The dark vessels held their position between the two forces, with the patience of beings who measured time in decades rather than minutes. The droid fighters were recoordinating. Data had estimated 4 minutes for backup, protocols to re-establish full coordination, and 90 seconds of that had already elapsed. The window was closing. "Hail Dooku's vessel," Picard said. Worf looked up from tactical with an expression that communicated professional skepticism without a single word. "Captain." "I know," Picard said. "Do it anyway." The channel opened. For 11 seconds there was nothing, the deliberate silence of someone receiving a communication and choosing the terms of their response with care. Then the view screen shifted, and Count Dooku looked at Jean-Luc Picard across the distance between their ships, with the particular expression of a man who found the universe perpetually insufficiently interesting and was mildly surprised to encounter an exception. He was tall, white-haired, possessed of an aristocratic bearing so complete it seemed less like a personality trait and more like a structural feature. The way a cathedral had flying buttresses, functional, deliberate, load-bearing. His eyes moved across the view screen with rapid, comprehensive intelligence, cataloging Picard, cataloging the bridge behind him, finding Obi-Wan, finding Anakin, and settling on Anakin with an expression that was several things. Simultaneously, satisfaction, assessment, and something that was not quite sentiment but occupied the adjacent territory. "Captain," Dooku said. His voice was precisely what his appearance suggested it would be, resonant, unhurried, the voice of someone who had never needed to raise it to command attention. "You are a long way from wherever you originated." "Count Dooku," Picard said. "I'm going to dispense with the indirect approach, because I think you'll find it more interesting if I do. You want the young man. You cannot have him. I'm willing to discuss every other aspect of this situation, but that point is not negotiable." Something moved through Dooku's expression, amusement, perhaps, or the cousin of it. A starship captain with principles. How refreshing. His eyes moved to Anakin. "Young Skywalker, you appear to be healing well. I confess I'm impressed by your host's capabilities." He paused. "I did not take your hand out of malice. I took it because you left me no other option. You came at me with your anger rather than your ability, and your anger was not equal to the task." Anakin's jaw tightened. The medical monitor spiked. "I know," he said. The words came out quiet and flat, and entirely without the defensive heat that Dooku had clearly anticipated. And the Count's expression shifted fractionally in response, a recalibration. Picard noted. Dooku had expected anger and received acknowledgement, and he was deciding what that meant. "Interesting," Dooku said softly. "Count," Picard said, drawing the attention back to himself with the practiced ease of a diplomat who understood that conversations had centers of gravity and that controlling them was most of the work. "You diverted 17 warships from an active engagement to pursue one injured young man. aboard a vessel you've never encountered. That suggests he represents something to you beyond a military objective. I'd like to understand what. Dooku regarded him with what appeared to be genuine consideration. You are perceptive, Captain, and direct. I find I appreciate that. He folded his hands, the gesture reminding Picard, with a dissonance that was almost physical, of the ancient woman in her dark ship. The young man is the most significant force-sensitive being alive in this galaxy. Possibly in any galaxy, given your presence here. What he becomes, what he is shaped into, will determine the character of the next era of galactic history. I had hoped to. He paused, selecting his word with visible care. Redirect that shaping toward outcomes I consider more rational than those the Jedi Order would produce. By taking his hand, Anakin said, still quiet, still flat. By demonstrating that the Jedi Order could not protect you, Dooku said, that its teachings had not prepared you, that there were other paths. He looked at Anakin with an expression that contained, buried beneath layers of political calculation, something that Picard, who had spent 30 years learning to read people, identified with some. Surprise is genuine concern, not for Anakin's welfare, for what Anakin might become without what Dooku considered adequate guidance. The Order will tell you that your anger is a flaw, a corruption, a path to darkness. They will spend years attempting to excise it from you, and they will fail because it cannot be excised, it is structural. And their failure will leave you with an anger that has been shamed but not understood. And that is the most dangerous configuration possible. The bridge was very quiet. Picard was aware of Obi-Wan beside him, not moving, absorbing this with the stillness of someone for whom the words were landing in complex and uncomfortable ways. He was aware of Anakin, whose medical monitor had done something Beverly would later describe in her report as unprecedented. The force field output had, in the 90 seconds since Dooku began speaking, gradually decreased from its elevated state to a level she had not recorded since his deepest sleep. Not diminishment, settling. The way a frequency settled when it found its correct resonance. Dooku was, beneath everything, telling Anakin a truth. A partial truth, a self-serving truth. A truth deployed in service of goals that Picard found deeply objectionable, but a truth nonetheless. And Anakin's extraordinary perceptive capacity had recognized it. You're not wrong about the anger, Anakin said. A doctor on this ship told me something similar an hour ago. He paused. She also told me that understanding it is different from being consumed by it. That there's a third option between suppression and surrender. He looked at Dooku directly. You're offering me the second option, dressed up as the third. I can feel the difference. Dooku was silent for a moment. Then, with the smallest inclination of his head, the gesture of a man acknowledging a point genuinely scored, he said, You are more perceptive than you were in that hangar. I had help, Anakin said. Picard let the exchange breathe for exactly the right amount of time, then stepped back into the center of it. Count, your fleet is holding position. The vessels between us are holding position. Nobody is firing, which I consider a significant achievement given the number of weapons currently pointed at everyone in this vicinity. He kept his voice measured, conversational, the tone he used when he wanted to lower the ambient temperature of a situation without appearing to do so deliberately. I have 72 hours before my means of returning home becomes unavailable. Anakin Skywalker is a patient aboard my ship, not a prisoner and not a bargaining chip. When I leave, he goes back to his people. These are facts, not positions. And what do you want from me, Captain? Dooku asked. I want you to stand down your fleet, Picard said. Not because I'm threatening you. I think we've both assessed each other sufficiently to know that a direct engagement would be costly for both of us and decisive for neither, but because continuing this standoff serves no one's interests. And you are, whatever else you are, an intelligent man who understands the mathematics of diminishing returns. A long silence. Dooku looked at Picard, looked at Anakin, looked, briefly and with an unreadable expression, at the dark vessels holding their position between the fleets. You have until you leave, Dooku said finally. After that, young Skywalker returns to a galaxy that will not wait for him to finish healing. He paused. I suggest your doctor uses the time well. The channel closed. The separatist fleet held position, did not advance. did not retreat. 17 warships suspended in the cold. Arithmetic of a standoff. That Picard understood was not resolution, it was interval. The distinction mattered enormously. He'll hold, Obi-Wan said quietly. Not from generosity, from calculation. He wants to see what Anakin becomes in the next 72 hours. A pause, which means we have 72 hours. And Dooku is using them as an observation period. Then we use them better than he expects, Picard said. He turned to Anakin, who was still looking at the now dark view screen with an expression that was processing something large and complex and important. Are you all right? Anakin turned, looked at Picard with those blue eyes that were doing something new again, not the gratitude Beverly had seen, not the fury Worf had cataloged, not the focused calm of a warrior locating his enemy. Something quieter, something that might, with enough time and enough of the right conditions, eventually become something resembling peace. He wasn't entirely wrong, Anakin said, about what the Order will do, about what they'll try. No, Obi-Wan said, and his voice carried a weight that Picard suspected had been building since the mess hall. He wasn't entirely wrong. He met his Padawan's eyes. That is a conversation we should have had long before today. I am sorry that we haven't. The bridge crew found things to attend to with great professional interest. Anakin looked at his master for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, simply. The nod of someone accepting something offered sincerely. Not resolution. Beginning. Picard looked at the view screen, at the standoff holding its fragile shape in the space between fleets, and thought about 72 hours and what could be done with them by people who understood their value. Data, he said. Begin rift reactivation analysis. I want every option we have for reopening that crossing before the residual signature degrades completely. He turned back to his chair. And someone tell Dr. Crusher the immediate crisis has passed. From sickbay, Beverly's voice came through the comm before anyone could reach it. I heard, Captain. I'm already planning. He almost smiled. Of course you are. 72 hours was not, in the cosmic accounting of significant events, a very long time. Civilizations rose and fell across centuries. Wars consumed decades. The particular kind of damage that accumulated in a person across years of loss and isolation, and the slow, grinding weight of expectations they had never asked to carry. That kind of damage did not resolve in 3 days. Beverly Crusher knew this with the certainty of someone who had practiced medicine long enough to understand that healing was not an event but a direction, and that the most important thing you could give a patient beginning that direction was not a cure but a compass. She had 72 hours. She intended to use every one of them. The first 24 were medical. She completed 3 additional calibration sessions on the neural interface, each one expanding the prosthetics, functional parameters as Anakin's nervous system, and the force field that ran through it, negotiated their new relationship with what she could only describe as remarkable speed. By the end of the first day, the prosthetic hand was operating at 98.7% efficiency across all tested parameters, with force field integration so complete that the interface boundary had effectively dissolved. The new hand was not a prosthetic attached to a person. It was a part of a person, as fully inhabited as any biological structure she had ever treated. She documented everything, every procedure, every calibration decision, every anomalous reading and its resolution, every moment where the force integration had surprised her and what she had done in response. The documentation was not for her own records, those she kept separately, in the precise clinical shorthand of a doctor who trusted her own memory but respected the discipline of written record. This documentation was for Anakin, a complete technical account of what had been done, how it had been done, and why each decision had been made, written in language that assumed intelligence and respected autonomy. She gave it to him on the morning of the second day, printed on a PADED in the Federation standard format that he could not read without the universal translator's assistance, and watched him sit with it for 2 hours in the chair beside the viewport in sickbay, working through it with the focused thoroughness of someone who had decided that understanding a thing completely was a form of reclaiming it. You documented the force integration, he said when he looked up. I documented everything, Beverly said, including my uncertainties and where I improvised. You should know where the solid ground is and where I was working on instinct. He looked at the PADD for another moment. Nobody has ever given me a document explaining my own treatment before. Does the Jedi Order not practice informed consent? Beverly asked. I don't know what that is, he said. She explained it. He listened with the particular quality of attention he brought to things he found genuinely interesting, complete, unperformed, the attention of someone for whom learning was not a social performance, but a private appetite. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The idea that a patient has the right to understand and agree to everything done to their body, he said slowly. That's not how medicine works here. You defer to healers. They know more than you do. They do know more about medicine, Beverly said. But you know more about you than any healer ever will. Those are different kinds of knowledge, and both of them matter. She paused. The most effective treatment I can design is always one the patient understands and has chosen. Compliance and consent produce very different outcomes, even when the treatment is identical. He absorbed this for a long time. She left him to it and went back to her station, because she understood that some ideas needed space to unfold, without someone watching them do it. The second 24 hours belonged to Obi-Wan. Picard had offered the Jedi Master guest quarters, and Obi-Wan had used them primarily as a location to conduct the most difficult conversation of his relationship with his Padawan, which Beverly understood had happened on the evening of the first day from the readings on Anakin's medical monitor, a sustained period of elevated emotional output that cycled through several distinct profiles before settling, eventually, into something that the monitor registered as the lowest stress baseline she had recorded. Since his arrival, she did not ask what was said. It was not her conversation. What she observed in Anakin afterward was a quality of, not ease, exactly. Ease was too simple a word for something that had clearly been complex and painful and necessary. It was more like the difference between a weight being carried and a weight being set down and examined. It was still heavy, but it was no longer entirely alone. She spent the second day's medical hours working with him on a different kind of documentation, a personal record of his own force field patterns created using her modified tricorder readings that showed him what his bioenergetic output looked like in different emotional states. She had never thought of biometric data as therapeutic before, but watching Anakin study the visual representations of his own force field, seeing his anger as a frequency rather than a verdict, seeing his grief as a measurable presence rather than a shameful weakness, she revised her understanding of what information could do in the right hands. He spent 2 hours cross-referencing his emotional states with their corresponding force field signatures and asking questions that ranged from deeply technical to quietly personal, and Beverly answered all of them with the same straightforward precision, because she had learned that he responded to consistency, the way some patients responded to comfort. It was itself the comfort. When I'm afraid, he said at one point, studying the readout, the field concentrates in my chest. The limbic system. Yes, Beverly said. That's where your emotional processing is most concentrated. Fear activates it strongly in most people. In you, because your nervous system amplifies everything through the force field. It's significantly more pronounced. Jedi are taught to release fear. Releasing fear and understanding fear are different actions, Beverly said. One removes information. The other uses it. He looked at the readout for a long time. I'm afraid of losing people, he said. It's the primary fear. Everything else is secondary. I know, Beverly said gently. I lost my husband when my son was very young. A mission. He didn't come back. She kept her voice even. Because this was not about her. She was offering it as a bridge, not a destination. The fear of loss after that was the largest thing I carried for years. It shaped every decision, every relationship, every moment of vulnerability I allowed or didn't allow. He looked at her. What changed? I stopped treating the fear as an enemy, she said. It's not an enemy. It's information about what I love. The question I learned to ask wasn't how do. I stopped being afraid. It was what does this fear tell me about what matters? And what do I do with that? The monitor registered a sustained output elevation, not a spike, a deepening. That's the third option, he said quietly. That's what you meant before. Yes, Beverly said. The third 24 hours moved differently. Data had found a viable path to reactivating the rift, not the original crossing, which had collapsed completely, but an adjacent quantum, variance in the dimensional boundary that could be artificially widened using the Enterprise ES deflector dish at a specific modulated frequency for a specific duration. The window was narrow, the approach required precise navigation, and they would get exactly one attempt. Data had expressed confidence in the calculation at 96.3%, which for Data was as close to certainty as the universe permitted. Picard spent the morning of the third day on the bridge running the final preparations and the afternoon in his ready room writing something he had never written before, a captain's log entry that he knew would be reviewed by Starfleet Command and that needed to account for 3 days of events that had no precedent in Federation history, no regulatory framework, and no established protocol. He wrote it with the care he gave every log entry and the additional care he gave things that future generations might read and need to understand. He also wrote something else, a personal letter addressed to no one specific, that he placed in Anakin's medical file alongside Beverly's documentation, a reflection from a starship captain who had spent 30 years navigating the collision between principle and reality, on what it meant to carry exceptional ability in a universe that did not always know what to do with it. He was not certain Anakin would ever read it. He was certain it needed to be written. Beverly spent her final hours completing her documentation and conducting one last examination that confirmed everything the previous 2 days had established. The neural interface was fully integrated. The force field was stable. The wound site had healed completely, and her patient's overall physiological condition was, by every measurable standard, better than it had been at any point since his arrival. She stood beside the bio-bed on the morning of departure and looked at Anakin Skywalker, who stood in the middle of sickbay with his hands at his sides, both of them, and looked back at her with those blue eyes that were doing something she had never seen them do before in there. 3 days together. They were simply present, not calculating, not managing, not performing composure over something difficult underneath. Simply here, in this room, with this person, in this moment. I don't have a way to thank you that's equal to what you did, he said. You don't need one, Beverly said. That's not how it works. How does it work? She considered this seriously, because he asked seriously. You carry it forward, she said. Whatever you received here that was useful, you carry it into what comes next. And eventually you find ways to offer something like it to someone else who needs it. That's the accounting. She paused. Medicine doesn't require repayment. It requires continuation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his robe and produced the PADD she had given him, her documentation of his treatment, and held it. I can't take this with me. The universal translator won't function without the ship's computer. Beverly had anticipated this. She had spent an hour the previous evening working with the universal translator database and a handheld transcription unit. She took the PADD from him and handed him a different one, the same documentation, rendered by patient cross-referencing into a notation system that Anakin had taught her over their 3 days together, a technical script used by Jedi archivists for medical records. It was imperfect, a translation twice removed, but it was readable without Federation technology. He looked at it for a long time. When he looked up, he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Beverly nodded once. Go, she said. Obi-Wan is waiting. The departure was coordinated across 3 locations simultaneously. Anakin and Obi-Wan transported back to a Republic vessel that had positioned itself below the Enterprise E at Picard's request, the dark vessels withdrawing to a respectful distance, and the Enterprise moving into position for Data's Rift reactivation sequence with the careful precision of a ship that understood it had one attempt and intended to use it correctly. Picard stood at the view screen and watched the Republic vessel move away, and thought about 72 hours and what they contained, and thought about a galaxy that was moving into its darkest period, with a young man who was perhaps, no certainty, no guarantee, only the fragile, persistent possibility, slightly better equipped to navigate it than he had been 3 days ago. It was not enough. He knew that. Beverly knew it. The ancient woman in her dark ship knew it with the weight of centuries of watching. Futures unfold in directions that good intentions had failed to redirect. But it was something, and something, in the mathematics of the possible, was not nothing. Data, Picard said. Take us home. The deflector dish fired. The dimensional boundary tore open. That same burning white and gold edge. That same sense of a universe taking a breath, and the Enterprise moved through it with the purposeful elegance of a vessel that knew where it was going. Behind them, in a galaxy far away, a young man stood on the deck of a Republic cruiser and looked at a hand that a Starfleet doctor had given him, and felt through it the living current of the Force, and held in his other hand a PADD written in 2 languages that meant the same thing. The rift closed. The stars of home surrounded the Enterprise on every side, familiar and precise, and exactly where Data's navigation had promised they would be. Picard exhaled slowly, looked at the view screen for a long moment, then turned to his crew, his extraordinary, reliable, irreplaceable crew, and said what needed to be said. Well done, all of you. Beverly's voice came through the comm from sickbay, where she was already writing the most unusual medical report of her career. Captain, on reflection, I'd do it again. Picard looked at the stars, thought about a boy with blue eyes and a prosthetic hand and a PADD written in 2 languages, thought about what carry it forward meant across the distance between galaxies. Yes, he said quietly. So would I. In the weeks that followed the Enterprise's return, Beverly Crusher's medical report on Anakin Skywalker's treatment circulated through Starfleet. Medical under a classified designation that did not prevent it from becoming, among those who read it, one of the most discussed documents of the decade. Not for its account of the dimensional crossing, nor for its description of a galaxy operating on principles Federation science could not fully classify. What doctors and ethicists and medical educators returned to, again and again, was its final section, a reflection on informed consent, on the therapeutic value of treating exceptional patients as people rather than phenomena, on the difference between suppression and understanding as medical philosophies. Beverly never learned what became of Anakin Skywalker. The rift was gone, the galaxy was unreachable, and the universe kept its own counsel on the question of whether 3 days and 1 doctor's careful attention had moved anything in the vast, slow machinery of fate. But she had practiced medicine for long enough to know that you could not always see the outcomes of the seeds you planted. You planted them anyway. You documented them carefully. You handed the patient their own records in a language they could read without your technology, and you told them to carry it forward. And you trusted that forward was a direction that eventually led somewhere worth going. In a galaxy far away, a young man with a prosthetic hand and a choice to make would carry that trust across years that were going to be harder than anything Beverly Crusher's careful instruments could have measured. Whether it was enough was a question the universe had not yet answered. It was, perhaps, still being asked.